Okay. So, good afternoon and welcome to our pre-Passover webinar on including all four children at the Seder. Because, yeah, the time of year is upon us. It's, getting up there. Okay. So, first of all, I want to start with a drush about Passover food because I've noticed something. When I say Passover food is super delicious, people usually push back on that. If I say, show of hands, who thinks Passover food is delicious? I usually don't get many hands raised, except for, that one contrarian who's generally in the room. If I say, who likes chocolate? Who likes cheese? Who likes fish? Who likes meat? Who likes potatoes? Who likes asparagus? Who likes artichokes? Generally speaking, there will be everyone in the room will like at least one of those things. And all of those things are things that can be and often are kosher for Passover. But when people think Passover food, what they tend to be thinking of is food that is not chametz, that is not leavened, but that is sort of pretending to be leavened food and getting really close to approximating it, sort of. Like this cereal that kind of tastes like paste, these rolls that are kind of made of matzah meal, these cookies that are made of matzah meal and some sort of like jelly, these potato things of various sorts. And a lot of those things are really not so tasty, but they're approximating chametz, they're approximating stuff that's not kosher for Passover. And there's this thing, when we don't accept Passover and we try to make food as similar as possible to what we would be eating if it wasn't Passover, if we could eat leavened stuff, we get a lot of things that really don't taste very good, that might look sort of like what we're used to, but really don't taste all that good. And if we accept it and work with it rather than against it, we can have some stuff that's super delicious. Something similar is true about disability. If we, as people with disabilities or as people teaching students with disabilities, value doing things in ways that look as normal as possible or are as similar to normal as possible, we might get close. We might get things that look similar, but that are kind of about as appealing as like those Passover Cheerios and those Passover like matzah meal cookies. If we accept disability, if we accept Passover and work with it rather than against it, we can be chocolate instead of a Passover roll. So that's what I like to go for. And so Passover is my favorite holiday. I absolutely love the Haggadah. I spend a lot of time year-round studying the Haggadah. And as somebody who specializes in Jewish disability issues, I'm often a visiting rabbi in a fairly wide range of communities, and I'm often presenting on the Passover Haggadah and why I love it and all kinds of disability things that I see in the Haggadah. And recently, when kids are in the room, questions get asked. So recently this happened. I was talking about all of the weird things we did in the Seder, and I said that the Talmud and other Jewish texts say that the reason we do weird things at the Seder is so that kids will stay interested and ask questions. And of course, there's this 10-year-old kid in the room who puts up his hand, and if you're giving a public talk about this kind of thing and a kid asks a question, you kind of have to call on them. So I did. This kid says, "That's the reason it's not working." My best response is, "Okay, kid, you've got a point. If you tell me it's not working and that you're bored, I believe you. And if I'm telling you that you're supposed to be interested, it's not working is a really fair point." And so it got me thinking about how we do Passover, how we're told over and over it's supposed to be meaningful, it's supposed to be interesting, it's supposed to be everybody's story. And at the same time, there are a lot of kids who And I think a lot of adults too, who will say, well, if that's what it's supposed to be, it's not working, can we please just go eat already? And I've been thinking about this kid's challenge, just thinking, why is that and what can we do about it? So the question is, why can it be hard to make Seders interesting? Because I think we all kind of agree that they should be. And I definitely know that what I grew up with was sometimes interesting, but I spent a lot of time being bored, and I spent a lot of time like escaping from the table doing other things that were more interesting. So we have this idea, the whole ritual is designed, like most of the answers to the questions of why do we do this are so the kids will be interested and ask questions. And yet sometimes that's a bit problematic. So why can it be hard to make Seders interesting? So one reason is that the Haggadah was written by rabbis, and it was written for rabbis who were super nerdy, super into all of this stuff, and who really didn't know so much about teaching, partly just because of when it was written. And we figured out a lot of things about teaching since then. And while I am a super nerdy rabbi, most people are not, and everyone needs to be part of it. So Seder itself has a lot of really great content that I just think is some of the best stuff there is, but it doesn't always have great methods of helping everyone to access the content because it's written by super nerdy rabbis who think that dense text-heavy midrash that depends on getting a lot of references to other texts is interesting, fascinating, and fun. I agree with them. I think that's fun. And I think that the way that we talk about it needs to work for everyone, including people who are not super nerdy rabbis. So if the objective is to build an interesting conversation for everyone, including super nerdy rabbis, people who are not super nerdy rabbis, people who might be more skeptical or have varying range of backgrounds, how do we create a conversation where everyone can be included, everyone can feel valued, and everyone can contribute, and everyone can see it as something that's a good use of their time? And I think that the secret ingredients, as in many things, is acceptance. In order to have a Seder that works well, acceptance is really important of the people we're with, of the context we're in, and of the limits and possibilities that we're facing, because not everything's going to work for every group. The Seder that I did in yeshiva, when almost everyone there was like a yeshiva student in a certain mindset, had a lot of things that were really great for that group and that would never in a million years work for pretty much any other Seder I'm ever going to be at, and certainly not when there's children around. And I think that one place that Seders can become problematic is when we fall into the trap of thinking about what kind of Seder do we want to have, and then who are the people? We think like, who are the people, what's the context, and what's possible? Where are the limitations that we need to accept? Where are the possibilities and potentials that we can build on, work with it, whether than against it? Seders get much better. Along those lines, show don't tell is an important principle of writing, and it's an important principle of Seders. We can't tell people to find things meaningful. Either people find things meaningful or they don't. And if people don't find things meaningful in the way that we would like them to, showing them changes things, telling them does not. If people are bored, telling them that the story is interesting won't make them interesting. When we lead Seders, we need to show participants that we're doing something meaningful, and sincerity and perceived sincerity is really important to that. Similarly, I think that in the quest to end the boarding Seder, yeah, totally on board with ending the boarding Seder, but there's something that I think can ultimately be counterproductive, which is this idea that the opposite of boredom is fun, and that what we need to do is make it fun. don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to fun, and I'm not opposed to Seders being fun. Fun is great. And the opposite of boring isn't fun. The opposite of boring is interesting. And I think that Seders, whether they're fun Seders or not fun Seders, can do things beyond fun, because the liturgy has depth, and asking good questions is, and having good conversations and telling and learning our story, they need to be objectives that can perhaps coexist with fun, but shouldn't be superseded by fun, because the questions are important and the storytelling is important, and it is possible to do that. And so I think that that's a focus that we should look at. Okay, I'll skip that. So thinking about being interesting. So how do we be interesting? How do we have conversations that are interesting, not boring, and include everyone? So being interested starts from being interested. Being interesting starts with being interested. And I think that the best way to be interested is often to be specific. So I think that whether you're a leader or not a leader, going through the Haggadah before Passover, finding what seems interesting to you, finding parts that you think will be interesting to others, and focusing on those parts can really change the experience. And again, I want to emphasize, even if you're not the leader, thinking in advance about what questions you have and what's interesting to you can make the whole thing go much better and be much more interesting. Similarly, learning from experience can be a good way to plan for interestingness, because the great thing about Passover is that it happens every year and we can keep getting better at it. So thinking about, what have we tried in the past? What's worked? What hasn't? What would you like to try again? What would you rather not do? And are there new things you would like to try? So I know the way I grew up, we didn't always think about this. We didn't always think about the possibility of doing things differently, and the possibility of not continuing to do things that were not working for people. And like realizing that I could actually think about what worked, what doesn't, and what could be done differently changes things a lot. And I think that something that's really key in making it work for the whole group is learning from other participants. Again, whether or not you're the leader, planning to learn from other participants can make the conversation much better, much more inclusive, and much more of an everyone kind of thing. So thinking about, what questions do you have about the Seder? What questions might participants be able to help you answer, both in general, because other people know stuff and there's always insights that can come to anything, but also more specifically, what do other people in the room know? What kind of expertise and insight might they be able to bring to the conversation? And how might they be able to help you answer questions that you have? Some examples of kinds of participant expertise that can be relevant at a Seder is that a kid who knows a lot about frogs will likely have some opinions about the 10 plagues and whether the frogs are a plague or not, and why one might start with frogs, where one might expect frogs, right? Like, so kid who knows a lot about frogs is likely to have opinions there. And if you think about how could that answer questions that I have, then Seder's likely to be more interesting for everyone, and the frog questions are less likely to be seen as disruptive. Similarly, a human rights activist will likely have some insights about slavery as it exists now, as it exists in the past, and as the Haggadah is interpreting it. Educators and kids tend to have a lot of opinions about the 4 children, and they're useful opinions. So a decorator for instance, might have thoughts on the difference between idolatry and beautiful religious spaces. So the issue of idolatry and idol worship comes up in the Haggadah as well. And, what's the difference between idol worship and decorating a Sefer Torah and kissing it, building a fancy ark in a synagogue, is a question that an artist or a decorator might have a lot of thoughts about. So whatever kinds of expertise people have, thinking about what is people's expertise, what do they know about, what do they care about, and what bearing might it have on questions I have about Passover or the Jewish story, can make a conversation that includes a broader range of people. This can be particularly significant as a way of including autistic people who are the kind of autistic people who have one really focused interest that people tend to want them to, damp down and not talk about so much. Thinking about what could all of those things they know about the subway or frogs or Pokemon or slavery or, Futurama or whatever else it is that they're into, what relation could that have to the story, and how could it add something to the conversation that otherwise wouldn't be there? What do people know? What bearing does it have on the Seder, and what focus does that suggest? And again, you can plan for this in one way if you are the leader, but if you're not the leader, you can still think about this. Like, what does the leader know that you might have questions about? What's likely to come up? And how can you support people in asking questions and valuing that expertise in the conversation? Whether you're the leader or not, thinking this way can change the conversation, be more inclusive, and mean that you learn new things. So there are a lot of ways that, particularly as the leader, setting the stage for success, again, this is the secret ingredients is acceptance, means that we have better conversations. And there's, I think, a couple of key components of this. One is making sure that people will be sufficiently physically comfortable to be physically and emotionally comfortable to be able to participate, making it understandable and creating meaningful ways for people to participate, to be participating and finding a way in. So avoiding intolerable hunger is really important, and something that I know that as a kid would have made a huge difference for me, because getting between unwillingly hungry people and food often doesn't go well. When questions mean waiting longer for food, people are often both reluctant to ask them themselves and resentful of other people who do ask them, because they just want to okay, enough already, let's eat. So planning to avoid intolerable hunger can really make a huge difference and change the conversation. And again, this is particularly true, say, for people who have, anxiety and might get really distressed about not being able to predict when food is coming, or people who have other types of eating issues, or for whom the physical experience of hunger would be particularly challenging. But for the whole group, it can often make a pretty big difference. So which way of avoiding intolerable hunger will work best depends a lot on the community and the group and the particular Seder. And so here's some options. So for some people, eating before candle lighting, either eating themselves or just feeding children so that there's some sort of substantive snack to tide them over until the substantial food later, can reduce the intolerable hunger problem. Another option is using substantial food for karpas, and we'll talk about that shortly, or planning to make snacks available to those who might need them. All three of those things can be good options in different contexts and can really, even without other adjustments, make the conversation at the Seder table possible for a lot of people it isn't possible for otherwise. So some people have the custom of eating a small meal or big snack before candle lighting, or just feeding kids who might need that, even if adults don't, which can avoid grumpy hunger during the Seder, especially for little kids who like normally would eat their meal really early and then are having to stay up super late at night. Again, not the right approach for everyone. For some people, it really helps. Another approach, which is the one that I tend to argue for, is using substantial karpas instead of just using parsley and water. So to understand why I think this is a good idea and why I think it's actually a pretty strong traditional approach to doing the Seder, is that the parsley thing is relatively recent. And where the form of the Seder came from is ancient world formal meals enjoyed by like high status free people. For instance, the Greek symposium made into this sanctified Jewish form. So, and at these meals, there would be the meal would begin with a dipped appetizer, and that's where karpas comes from. And so many have the custom of bringing back the custom of using substantial appetizers for karpas so that it will be more like this meal in this formal symposium kind of free-flowing meal enjoyed by free people, at which one might start with an appetizer. And so when this is offered, people are much less likely to spend the magid hangry and reluctant to engage. And this is like partly something that can help kids, but it's also something that can be really helpful to adults who aren't sure that they're really on board with this discussing stuff at length during the Seder thing. So I think this is good. I know that I'm a better leader when I do it this way, and I've found that it's really helpful to a lot of people I've led Seder for. So within this, if you're taking this custom of bringing back the karpas as an appetizer tradition, what can it be? Karpas food needs to be something that can be dipped in something else. It's okay if it's several types of things, and you can leave it out throughout the magid. The one thing it shouldn't have is it shouldn't have matzah or something with matzah in it, because that comes later in the Seder with when we do the meal and make hamotzi and eat matzah. So if you are concerned about that level of technicality, it is better if it is not matzah, but anything else that's dippable in dip should be fine. So some possibilities if you're taking this appetizer approach to karpas, you could do strawberries and chocolate syrup. You could do dried fruit and melted chocolate, chips and guacamole, carrots and celery and spinach dip, artichokes and mayonnaise, or if you're a kidney oat eater, hummus and veggies can be good karpas, and will certainly probably get questions asked. But I found that this can, first of all, reduce the hunger issue, the people being like intolerably and unwillingly hungry problem. And it can also be a way to establish trust early on and to show people that you want them to have a good experience and you understand these needs and you're planning for it. Again, not the only way to do it. Different people have different customs, but it's something that can be effective at both solving the practical problem and solving some of the problem of building trust and creating space for conversation to happen in. So similarly, substantial karpas isn't a good option for every group, but making snacks available maybe away from the table in some form for people who need them, especially, again, little kids, can really make it doable for people who would otherwise have meltdowns. And if you're that person, like, know that about yourself and plan for it. So switching gears a bit, helping people understand what's going on, for the educational objective of getting people to understand the story important, also helps things to be less boring. One reason people sometimes get bored and checked out at Seders is because it's this huge, incomprehensible wall of long things that they don't understand and can't predict. And so making that more transparent for people can be really helpful. One way to do that is to have musical transition and to sing the Seder song up to the point you're at. Yeah, I'd highly recommend doing that. I found that smooths it out a bit. One thing that we found really helps is a resource that we created a few years ago. It's our Seder visual schedule that shows people what to expect and helps people understand where are we in the Seder, what's going to happen, why and when, and what's next. So it's printable, it's on our website. The URL is in the slide, and I will also put it into the chat. Okay, so, and we have a page for the signs of the Seder for each cup and for the meal, and it helps people just understand what's going on. And we made it with autism in mind because a lot of autistic people find visual schedules helpful for understanding what's going on. A lot of educators find that things go more smoothly for autistic students if they have a visual schedule of this sort of type. But we've actually found that it ended up being useful to a much broader range of people, including just kids, and also adults who maybe weren't super familiar with the whole structure and were a little intimidated by how long and unwieldy it is. And so this is a resource that can be really helpful pretty much for any group of sighted people. And if you're the leader, you can make this available. And if you're not the leader and you're going to be at a Seder with your kids or some people, you can still print it out and use it to follow it yourself or to show your kids what's going on and what's going to happen next. So yeah, that's comprehension and making the structure obvious to people can be very helpful. And for the rest of this, what I'm going to talk about is creating ways to ask questions and support question asking specifically, because most people know that you are supposed to ask questions at a Seder. It's so kids will ask questions, right? And sometimes it's really hard to ask questions, and people usually need more than being told you're supposed to ask questions to be able to actually ask their questions. So what can we do to support question asking, either as the leader or not the leader? Also speaking of questions, I'm watching the group chat. So if anyone would like to ask a question in the chat, I'm looking at it, I'll see it, and I will respond to it. So just so you know. So one thing that I've found can be useful for Seder leaders is to make it known at the beginning that when people ask a question, they'll get a piece of candy. Doesn't necessarily have to be candy. I've seen frogs, I've seen raffle tickets, I've seen various other things. It's actually, if you do it right and if you follow up, can work really well for both kids and adults. And kind of on the most simple, basic level, it incentivizes questions, but that's not actually the main reason I think it's worth doing. I think it actually does something else that's much more important. And what it does, what offering a candy reward for questions does that's the most important, is it gives people permission to ask questions and it creates safety. Because it's not mostly about incentives, especially when you're doing it with adults, because like candy is not that much of a high value reward for adults. Adults can get their own candy. And if people are, so it's mostly about communication and showing trust. Offering rewards for questions communicates that you really mean it when you say that questions are welcome and that you want them. And it can often be, it's not so much about the candy, so much that the candy communicates, yes, your question is welcome and wanted. Another thing that it does is it gives people plausible deniability. It creates safety by creating plausible deniability, because somebody who might be embarrassed about not knowing something or not sure it's okay to ask a question can pretend that they're just doing it for the candy and save face. It makes it okay to ask basic questions or to participate, because you don't make yourself as vulnerable when you don't have to reveal as much intrinsic motivation to be able to participate. So, if people are doing it because they're hungry, that's a problem and they should be fed, but this is a form of communication I think can be very valuable. Another way to create space for asking questions is to thank people for their questions when they ask it. It sends a really strong message that you're serious about welcoming questions, especially for people who might have felt hesitant or insecure. Like, if somebody asks, why is matzah square or whatever? Or what do you mean we're still slaves? We're not slaves. It might feel uncomfortable, either feeling like maybe everyone else knows, or maybe this isn't an okay question. And if you say, wow, thank you for that question, they know that you wanted it. And other people who are watching, who might not be sure their question is okay, take a lot of cues from how you act when other people ask. So even if you don't think the person who's asking you needs that, the person watching might. And it can make a really big difference, especially for people who struggle with communication, or for people with disabilities who may have gotten used to feeling like they're not sure they can count on being welcome. So this creates a lot of potential for trust and safety. So more generally speaking, it's important to take questions seriously. One thing I see happen a lot is that sincere questions get misinterpreted as jokes. Again, sometimes this happens on purpose because people don't want to look stupid, and they'd rather look like they're joking than like they don't know. So people who ask very basic questions sometimes get laughed at, and it's really hard to ask questions if you think people might laugh at you. And it's really hard to keep asking questions if people do laugh at you. And it's really hard to say, actually, I don't know and I would like an answer, if you think people might stop respecting you. So if somebody asks a question, I think it's really important to err really strongly on the side of assuming that it might be a serious question, even if you think it might not be. And this is particularly important for kids, and it's particularly important for people with communication disorders, because people who have communication disorders may often find themselves in a situation where they ask a question in a way that feels straightforward to them and everybody laughs at them, or they can't ask a question in the usual way, and so people think they're cute and joking and don't answer. So if you know someone has a communication disorder, err particularly strongly on the side of assuming that their question may have been intended seriously, and that it may be worth investigating more, even if it's hard to imagine that someone wouldn't know that. Another reason that people with disabilities often ask questions that sound too basic is because people with disabilities have not always had access to Jewish education and Jewish community. So there might be some things that, for instance, everybody who goes to camp would know, but not everyone's necessarily welcome at camp or at school or wherever else, which means that you can't assume background based on what you know about people's family, because often the reality for people with disabilities is different. And it can be really scary to admit that you don't know something if other people do. So it's really important to be careful about taking questions seriously and to be careful about not laughing at people who might be serious. So, and if someone is laughed at, the way we respond is really important and can make or break the conversation for people. So again, especially if you're the leader, but even if you're not, if somebody gets laughed at and there's any possibility that that person wasn't joking, don't laugh yourself. Wait a few seconds for the laughter to stop, and either ask them like, "Did you mean that? Was that a serious question? Should I answer that?" Or just start answering. Because when often the answer is yes, I meant that seriously. And often somebody taking it seriously makes it okay to say that and makes it okay for other people to start admitting that they know things. When a respectful tone is set, the conversation opens up dramatically, especially if there are a lot of co-conspirators in making sure that a respectful tone is set. And so another thing is that communication is really hard for a lot of people. Some people need help. Some people need help asking their questions in ways that others can understand. Some people need help articulating things or clarifying for themselves what they're asking. And so a couple of cautions about this. One is that if you're confused about what someone's asking, it's often better not to bluff and to be careful about answering too soon. Because if somebody's having trouble communicating and they get the sense that you think you've answered and would like to move on, it can be really hard to keep asking and say, actually, what I meant was. It's also important to be careful about speaking for people. Because, for instance, if you're supporting someone with a communication disability, in asking a question and they're having trouble being understood, can often be really tempting to say, oh, he means like X, it's about matzah, just to like make the awkward pause go away, or to because you don't want them to struggle. But often the questions that we think people want to ask and the questions that they're actually asking can be different. So it's important to attend to how to help people ask questions without talking over them. Particularly important for anyone, but especially young kids, especially people with communication disabilities, especially people who are both young children and people with communication disabilities. So one method you can use is the or something else method. And the way this works is you make your best guess about what someone's asking, and then you check. For instance, like it maybe seems like from what they're saying that maybe they're asking about matzah. You can ask, are you asking why we eat matzah? Or are you asking about something else? And then you kind of keep guessing and narrowing down your guess and checking guesses. And then once they confirm that you've gotten the question right, then you start answering it. And then you can say, did that answer what you were asking, or do you still have a question? And for people who struggle to use clear words that others can understand, often often will either get ignored or interrupted. And when we help by providing this kind of support and scaffolding and making our best guess and checking, it enables a lot of communication that would otherwise not be heard. And again, this can be particularly important for people who are autistic or have similar communication disorders, especially when their form of communication is mostly in the form of, say, television references or memorized phrases. It can be really hard to know what someone means when what they're actually saying is like, taking SpongeBob's voice and saying like, I'm ready, I'm ready, I'm ready over and over, or saying, quoting Frozen and saying the cold never bothered me anyway. It can be hard to know what someone means, and often when somebody's repeating themselves over and over, it's because they're not being understood and heard. And so making guesses and checking them can really help people who communicate in that kind of way to be part of the conversation at the Seder. And when everybody is heard, everybody benefits. See, okay, I didn't switch that slide, but it's here. So another thing worth doing is saying, making it explicit using words that you care what someone's saying. Because sometimes it's not easy to tell. And often people who really struggle with communication learn that other people don't really want to listen to them. And often people give up. So if we say things like, I'm not sure what you're asking yet, but I want to know, or I don't understand, but I do care, it can really help, because when people know your care, they're much more likely to keep trying. And I think that we often assume, like those of us who really care about listening to people, that other people know that and that it goes without saying, but it really doesn't, because people who struggle with communication often spend a lot of their time interacting with people who really don't want to listen to them once it gets hard. So people can't read our minds. It doesn't go without saying. It's worth saying, like, I really want to understand what you're saying. Again, even if we have to go on, can say, like, we need to go on now, and I really want to understand what you're saying. Let's try again later is one thing you can say, but like, make it clear that you care and make it explicit, because people don't necessarily know if you don't tell them. So another part of this is noticing bias in silence. So I think that we've talked a lot in the past couple of years in particular about implicit bias, about how often when women speak up, they're seen as dominating the conversation, even if we're talking much less than men are. Often when women and girls speak up, people might dismiss our ideas and then think they're amazing when a man says it like 30 seconds later. And this happens a lot with people with disabilities as well. And so it's worth being proactive about noticing bias in silence. Just kind of pay attention. Are women and girls getting the chance to speak? And what happens when they say things and ask questions? Are people with disabilities getting the chance to speak? What happens when they speak up and ask questions? Are their questions taken seriously? And are they getting credit for their contributions and insights? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is sort of. And I think that it's another one of those, don't assume it goes without saying, but proactively pay attention to it. And again, whether or not you're the leader, this is an area in which it's really possible to make a big difference. One thing I would say about this, the way the disability issue can be different than the gender issue, is that often people with disabilities need to talk for a higher percentage of the time to get an equal amount of participation. If somebody has a communication disorder, or they take longer to process, or they're just more verbose, it might mean that they need to be spending more time talking to get an equivalent amount of participation and being heard. So it's not just the strict numeric thing, but it's important to pay attention to whose getting to contribute, who isn't, whose contributions are being valued, and how and under what circumstances, just what's going on in the room. Again, doesn't go without saying, doesn't happen by itself, even when everyone, as I'm sure we all are, is very well-meaning, to pay attention to it on purpose. So if you notice that someone isn't being taken seriously in the way that you think they should be, you can really change this dynamic by being proactive about taking them seriously yourself. If someone is interrupted, you can uninterrupt them. There's actually a cohort of other women in seminary who decided we were going to conspire to uninterrupt women, and like make sure that our classmates were respected. And so one thing you can do if people are being talked over is to say things like, Sarah, I was wondering about that too. What do you think the answer might be? Or if like Rachel's point was dismissed until David said it, you can say, I think that's what Rachel was saying. Is that what you were saying, Rachel? And I've seen that, like, particularly when the leader does it, but when anyone in the room does it, it really changes the conversation. You don't have to be rude about it. You can be like very polite about it, But if you attribute people's comments and if you show people that you value them, people participate more and there's a lot more equality. So similarly to that, sometimes doing it in the moment isn't the right way. But checking in with people who might need support and being taken seriously can really change their experience at the Seder and yours. So for instance, it can be worth checking in with them on one-on-one at some point during the meal or afterwards. For instance, points at which people are getting up to get food or do hand washing or something can be really helpful. Like, it can work well for that, both in the sense that like you can tell them that you thought that their comment was good or that you valued it. And it can also be really helpful when people know that you saw it too and that it's not just them. Even if nothing else changes, knowing that it is not just you can make a really big difference. So, and another way to support people who might not feel comfortable with their questions or might not be sure that they'll get heard is and again, this is as a leader or as a participant. This one actually sometimes works better if you're not the leader, is asking questions that you think others might want answers to but might not be comfortable asking. So sometimes it's really common for people that have questions but not be so sure if it's okay to ask or not want other people to know that they don't know. And particularly when people, like for instance, may not have a lot of Jewish education and may not want other people to know that, or might be someone who's not Jewish but is at a Seder and they're not really so clear on what questions are and aren't okay. Sometimes the best solution to that problem is to ask the question yourself, as somebody who feels safe doing so, and as someone who can like use that safety to create safety for others. So again, and if you're the leader, it can be helpful to get someone else who will be there ahead of time and sort of like ask them, you know, if you think other people ask questions, can you kind of help me out by asking some of those questions? Can kind of this, because if there's two people involved in making that happen, it can really help because then it's coming from the room. So do not underestimate the value of ringers. And so now I'm going to segue a bit into something that's more specifically some methods leaders can use to create ways into asking questions at the Seder that can maybe work for a broader range of people. Because going around the table, taking turns reading is great, and sometimes it helps to mix it up a little. So one way to use going around the table is to do a table go round of a question. Maybe asking the whole group, why do we remember that we were slaves in Egypt, for instance? Maybe go around the table, give everyone the opportunity to answer the question, which means that for people who have trouble initiating, or for people who worry that they might be interrupted or have trouble getting called on, having a time when it's clearly your turn can really make it possible to ask things. That said, it can also put people on the spot in a way that's awkward. So it's also important to give people like a comfortable way to pass. But going around the table, making it clear when people's turns are for question answering and asking can open it up for more people, including people who it may not be clear need help. Because some people who are very articulate or who you might see giving a speech or asking really smart questions in some contexts still might have a lot of trouble with initiating. And so creating ways where they don't have to ask can be really helpful. Can also help to avoid some of the implicit bias issues where like girls might not be called on as much as boys, people with disabilities might not be called on as much. Yeah, not necessarily the best thing for every group, but it can work really well for some groups. It can also be good to go around the table and give people the opportunity to ask questions as well as answer. And then you can sort of have this stacked availability of questions to play with. There are various ways you can do that, but it's worth considering the use of going around the table kinds of questioning. Another thing you can do is polling. Because when people have an opportunity to express an opinion, it can, first of all, enable them to express an opinion. And second of all, again, this is so much about communication and building safety. If you give someone an unthreatening way to ask an opinion, offer an opinion without being put on the spot, that sends them a message that their opinion is valued, and it can create comfort and safety in asking questions later in the Seder or right then. So polling can be a way where people don't necessarily have to talk about it, but can express an opinion in ways that get them into the conversation. So you can do this by asking for a show of hands or by asking for thumbs up, thumbs down. On an opinion question that you might want to have either discussion of or just kind of lay out there. For instance, do you think the Egyptians deserve the 10 plagues, right? It's thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle, right? And this gives people a way to show that their opinion is valued. But another thing that it can do is it can show people that it's okay to have a range of opinions and that it's okay not to be sure. And so polling can be, a way to create a way in, even if that's as far as it goes in the moment. So another method that's similar to polling that brings in a bit more movement, again, if you have a group for whom and a space for whom movement will work well, is the this side, that side game. And one way you can ask participants, go to the left side of the room if you think X, go to the right side of the room if you think Y. For instance, like Dayenu said it would be good enough if God had taken us out of Egypt but not done the plagues. If you agree, go to the left. If you disagree, go to the right. And then it brings in movement. It creates an opinion, a way to express an opinion without having to speak. Which first of all creates a way of expressing an opinion for people who can't speak or who feel uncomfortable speaking or have trouble speaking up in groups. And it shows that everybody's part of the room and everyone's opinion is part of the conversation, even if that's as far as it goes. But often it can go further than that because you can ask people to explain their opinions. You can ask people like, okay, so what do you mean? How would it have been enough? Why wouldn't it have been enough? Or, people who are in the middle, what questions do you have? Why aren't you sure? So it can be a way to help you figure out who to ask questions of and what questions they might have and places for opening. So there's a lot you can do with this side, backside game. Another thing sort of is that this is more on the communication support kind of thing, is that when you pause for questions and ask, does anyone have a question about this? Wait at least 7 seconds before you say anything else. And if there's people with communication disabilities or intellectual disabilities present, wait 14. Because if there's processing space, it shows people that you really do value the questions and that there really is time and space for them. If you just say, does anyone have questions? Okay, good, let's go on. It doesn't really create space for questions. So if you want people to think you mean it, you have to wait at least 7 seconds before saying anything else. Another thing you can do is you can use question starter slips. You can, like for Seder, write questions on pieces of paper and put the pieces of paper at place settings and get people to ask each other those questions. An entry point for people who are asking, if you're doing the ask questions, get candy thing, having questions around that people can read off of paper to ask can be a good way to bring people into that and giving them a way to participate that can start to be theirs. as well. So it can combine with a lot of things. So another way you can do this is by pulling questions out of a hat. So you can put slips of paper with questions on them into a hat, and or let other people write their own to go into the hat, either beforehand or if it's your practice to write on Passover during. And then ask people to draw questions from the hat and then discuss those questions, which allows questions to be asked without people having to admit that they're their questions. And it gives people a way to participate in the question asking, even if they don't want to directly ask a question themselves. And it's sort of this tactile, kinesthetic movement thing, which for some people can make focus and engagement much more possible. Again, not everything works for everyone, not everything works for every group, but for some people, the pulling questions out of a hat thing works well. Another thing you can do is break up the discussion a bit, and to do pair share. The way pair share works is you ask people to discuss the question with the person next to them for a few minutes, and then you can come back, and if anyone wants, they can also share with the whole group. And a reason this can work really well is, first of all, it's the trust and safety thing. A lot of people are much more comfortable talking to one person than the whole group. It's like, feel safer. It also allows more people to speak and get attention at the same time. Waiting your turn is hard. And especially for people who have attention issues, staying focused when other people are talking most of the time and you have to wait most of the time can be really hard. And if you do some small group or pair discussions, it can enable people who have certain kinds of attention issues to sometimes be much more successful and much more able to be engaged and participate. Problem with pair share is it also makes the room super loud. So again, a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. Doesn't always work for everyone or every group, but can be really good for some groups, particularly if you think about who's sitting where and how to make that work and where people can go. Another thing that can be helpful is thinking about making reading materials available, because discussion-based learning is great for a lot of people. It is not always the best for everyone. And I think that it's important for us to value a range of ways to participate. And for some people, the best way to learn how to Seder is to read the Haggadah or to read other things that are around. Some people would rather check a book before asking questions. Some people would rather look in a book to inform their questions, or rather just altogether just learn from the book. And so, first of all, like, making it just be okay and acceptable if somebody's reading the Haggadah to themselves more than they're participating directly. It's a way to differentiate and include a broader range of people. And also, it works better if the translation's good and there's interesting commentary. So offering a selection of different Haggadot, of different versions of commentaries, can be really helpful. Having supplements and things printed out and available can really make participation more possible and valuable for some people. And supplements, Haggadot.com is a good resource to find like a full range of different supplements you might want to include depending on who's in your group. Just, keeping in mind that reading is participation. It is not a refusal to participate. Similarly, creating space away from the table can be really important for some people. It's getting back to both the reading material thing and the pair share thing. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations happen either in the kitchen or off to the side, or when people have stepped out and they're in the other room. Some people need to wander in and out. Some people need to take a break from the noise. Sometimes like things are complicated, and it's like when it's assumed that will happen and that that's okay and that there's space to value it rather than seeing it as a failure. It gets back to the thing is the secret ingredient is acceptance. And when people value having the option of space away from the table, there's usually a reason for it. And so it's good to create space for it. Okay. And so we're almost at time. So more generally, remember that silence is not absence. Not everyone is comfortable speaking up in front of groups. Not everyone is ready speaking up in front of groups. Some people take longer to process. Sometimes questions are asked days later or next year. And it's likely that some people are always going to be more outgoing than others. That's really okay. Not everyone needs to be the same. Not everyone needs to participate in the same way. And our communities are stronger when there are a range of ways to participate and in which everybody is valued for the way that makes sense to them. And at the same time, remember that our story needs everyone's voice in some form or another, whether it's direct participation in this particular Seder conversation or not. Our Jewish story needs everyone's voice every year, always. Because even if we, and as it says in the Haggadah, even if we were all wise, all experts, all elders, all knowledgeable about the Torah, be a commandment upon us to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt together. It also says, in every generation, it is each person's obligation to see him, her, their self as if they had personally gone out of Egypt, because everybody's part in the story matters, is worth telling, and is part of the conversation in whatever form it takes. And because the secret ingredient is acceptance, and it's end with the Matan Jewish Disability Acceptance and Inclusion Pledge. I acknowledge that ability, disability, and humanity coexists, and I pledge to see my students as they are. I will not look past their disabilities. I will seek to understand. I will not overlook their abilities. I will seek to support them effectively. I will not ignore the humanity of my students. I will remember that they have individual interests, there's perspective of their own, and they were each created in the image of God. And as we go into the Passover Seder, it's my wish that all of you will find ways into the conversation for yourself, new questions and new ways into the conversation for those you're in community with. So yeah, kick forward. And I see that we're a couple minutes over time, so I think we're going to stop in a minute. Would anyone like to ask a question at this point? All right. Thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, to be continued.